Hello everyone. For some reason our video crapped out at the last couple of minutes there. So I'm going to just go through the last couple of notes that I had for chapter 13, and then we're going to move on and do some of chapter 14 in this video. I'm not going to keep you too long. I know the last video was 45 minutes long, so I'm going to try to be done within half an hour or so. So hopefully it doesn't take you forever to watch these videos before next week. So we'll see how far we can get into chapter 14. So I will just finish off. This is the very last slide in chapter 13, and for some reason it cut off my video halfway through the first sentence. But basically, in terms of the taking psychology with you for the development chapter, it basically just talks about the fact that there are so many different methods of parenting and sources trying to tell you what to do and what's best for your child. And of course that can make it very hard to determine what actually is supported by the evidence and what is better for your child. However, critical thinkers will draw upon two lines of evidence which are given in this chapter. One is that children thrive under a wide variety of child-rearing methods, and that babies have their own temperaments and genetic predispositions that will influence how it is best to raise them. So overall, we have four general principles which are encouraged in terms of child rearing. The first is to set high expectations that are appropriate to age and temperament. And you also need to be sure to teach your child how to meet them. So children tend to be helpful and above average in competence and self-confidence if they are given these expectations and shown the appropriate ways of reaching them. The second is to explain, which teaches children how to reason and understand. So when you're asked the why of something, even if it's the 10,000th time, try your best to explain. And when you're punishing them in some way or not allowing them to do something, it's important to explain why. But it is also important to note that once you have explained a rule, you want to reinforce it consistently. The third point is to encourage empathy, so to show the child how negative behavior disrupts or hurts others. Vague orders such as don't fight are far less effective than actually showing the child how they are disrupting or hurting others in terms of their behavior. That's much more effective in making them in discouraging that behavior in the future. And the fourth is not oversimplify. It's never, as we know, all genetic or all environment. And basically the last point to make here is that you have the profound ability to affect the quality of the relationship that you have with your child. So that is the end of chapter 13, and now we're going to move on to 14. So we'll go through the first little bit of this. So chapter 14 is on theories of personality. So we're going to talk a little bit about personality development and the various theories that people have come up with for explaining how our personality develops over time. So this chapter is going to explore how psychologists define and study personality. So personality defined is a distinctive pattern of behavior, mannerisms, and thoughts, motivations, and emotions that characterize an individual over time and across different situations. So this pattern consists of many distinctive traits. So traits are basically defined as habitual ways of thinking, behaving, and feeling. And some traits that we talk about often are being shy, outgoing, hostile, friendly, confident. All of those would be examples of traits. So the topics in this chapter are going to include a review of the oldest theory of personality, which is the psychodynamic view, yay, more Freud, and then the newest theory, which is the genetic view, as well as leading approaches to personality that aren't covered by either of these two. So we'll talk a little bit about the environmental approach, the cultural approach, and the humanist and narrative approaches. So I'm hoping to definitely get through the psychodynamic view today and maybe started a little bit into some of the other views by the time we finish up this video. So in terms of psychodynamic views of personality, the first psychodynamic theory of personality is Freud's theory of psychoanalysis. Of course, we're going to talk about Freud again. Whenever we're talking about the unconscious, he's pretty much our go-to. Just try to get this video. There we go. So Freud's theory of psychoanalysis is both a theory of personality and a method of psychotherapy, which contains many terms you may find familiar. Repression, regression, denial, and displacement. You've probably used all these terms in your life, and they are all actually related to Freud's theory of psychoanalysis. So Freud's theory is considered psychodynamic because it involves unconscious energy dynamics within the individual, so unconscious motives, conflicts, and attachments. Dynamic, the word dynamic is not used in today's sense. We often use it saying someone's dynamic as they're powerful or energetic, but it's instead used to refer to the motion and balance of systems under the action of external or internal forces, so the more physics-based definition of dynamic. We do have more current psychodynamic theories, so today's psychodynamic theories do differ from Freud's, but they all share an emphasis on unconscious processes in the mind as well as childhood experiences. So Freud believed that the unconscious revealed itself through art, dreams, jokes, apparent accidents, and slips of the tongue, also known as Freudian slips. So your textbook talks about somebody introducing somebody as the honorable member, I think this was in British Parliament, the honorable member from hell, instead of the honorable member from Hull. And so Freud would say that that was it was revealing his unconscious feelings towards that person. So his theory states that personality consists of three major systems. The first is the id, which is present at birth, and it basically consists of unconscious psychological motives to avoid pain and obtain pleasure. It involves two competing instincts, the life or sexual instinct, which is fueled by psychic energy known as the libido, and the death or aggressive instinct. So basically within the id, we would say that energy builds up and tension results. And so it can be discharged in the form of reflex actions, physical symptoms, or uncensored mental images and forbidden thoughts. So it's very much kind of the pleasure-seeking, pure kind of base desires of the person. Next we have the ego, which is the second section to emerge. And it is the referee between the needs of the instinct, so the needs of the id, and the demands of society. So it helps to put a rein on the id's desires. And it exists both consciously and unconsciously. So basically the ego is going to help rein in the id's desire for sex and aggression, and it represents reason and good sense. Finally, we have the superego, which is the last system to develop. It is the voice of conscience, it represents morality and parental authority, and it judges the activities of the id. And we would say that the superego is partially conscious but largely not. So it can make us feel both pride and shame depending on our actions and whether or not we're giving in to the impulses of the id. So again, the id is that unconscious kind of base motives. The ego is both conscious and unconscious and kind of acts as the referee. And then the superego is partially conscious but mostly not, and it is the voice of conscience. So you should know about all of these for sure. Conscience, sorry. So according to Freud, a healthy person must keep all three systems in check. If you're too controlled by the id, you're going to be impulsive and selfish. If you're too controlled by the superego, you'll be rigid and moralistic and bossy. And someone with a weak ego will be unable to balance personal needs and wishes with social duties and realistic limitations. If a person feels threatened when the wishes of the id conflict with social rules, the ego has weapons at its command to relieve the tension. So unconscious strategies known as defense mechanisms, which deny or distort reality in order to protect us from conflict or anxiety. And I'm sure you've heard the term defense mechanisms before. Defense mechanisms can be helpful in some situations. They become unhealthy only when they cause self-defeating behavior and emotional problems. So basically we would say these defense mechanisms arise in order to basically help the ego deal with the wishes of the id and the conflict that they cause with social rules and expectations. So we'll talk a little bit about the kind of the primary defense mechanisms that Freud described. So 5 of our primary defense mechanisms as identified by Freud, and later analysts, I can't speak tonight. So the first is repression, which is when a threatening idea, memory, or emotion is blocked from consciousness. It involves both unconscious expulsion and conscious suppression of disturbing material. However, modern analysts tend to think of it only as unconscious. The second is projection, which is when a person's own unacceptable or threatening feelings are repressed and attributed to someone else. So for example, your textbook says a person who is embarrassed about their sexual desire towards a certain ethnic group may say, those people are so dirty-minded and oversexed. So you're basically projecting your own feelings onto another group or another person. The third is displacement, which is when people direct their emotions towards something other than the real object that they're feeling. So they could direct them towards things, animals, or other people, but it's not basically what they're really feeling emotional about. So for example, if a child is mad at their parents and they obviously can't act upon that impulse, they may take it out on their toys, or maybe, you know, hit their younger sister. So that would be displacement. And then we have sublimation, which is when displacement serves a higher cultural or socially useful purpose. So if someone takes their negative emotions or even positive emotions towards something and uses them to create art, such as in painting or songwriting, then that would be considered sublimation. So when you're creating arts or inventions based on displacement of emotions, so you can't act out in the way you want to, so you channel those emotions into your work. The fourth is regression, which is when a person reverts to a previous stage of psychological development. And so Freud would say adults may regress when they're under pressure, children may regress when going through difficult life circumstances, so for example the divorce of parents. And then finally we have denial, and denial is basically when people refuse to admit that something unpleasant is happening. It helps to protect their self-image and preserves the illusion of invulnerability. So kind of the whole "it can't happen to me" mentality. So it could be with respect to mistreatment by a partner, that they have some kind of a problem, maybe a drinking problem or substance abuse problem, or that they are feeling a forbidden emotion. So there's many different things that people can feel denial about, but the key is basically just essentially refusing to admit that something is happening or that they're feeling that way. So in terms of the development of personality, Freud believed that personality developed through a series of psychosexual stages, in which the sexual energies take different forms as the child matures. He said that each stage produces a certain amount of frustration, anxiety, and conflict which must be resolved. If it is not, the child may remain fixated at the current stage. So the first stage that Freud mentioned in his psychosexual stages was the oral stage. So this basically occurs during the first year of life. Babies primarily experience the world through their mouths. If they become fixated at this stage, they will seek oral gratification as adults. So when we talk about oral fixation, that's kind of what they're referring to here. So they may engage in smoking, overeating, nail biting, etc. Something related to kind of their mouths. And they may become clingy or dependent like a nursing child. The second stage is the anal stage, from ages 2 to 3, when toilet training and bodily waste control are of key importance. If they become fixated at this stage, they may become either anal retentive, which is holding everything in and being obsessed with neatness, or anal expulsive, which is kind of the opposite of that, being messy and disorganized. The third stage, and the most, I would say, controversial stage in this theory, is the phallic or Oedipal stage. So in Freud's mind, the most crucial stage for personality formation is this stage. It's when the child unconsciously wishes to possess the parent of the opposite sex and get rid of the parent of the same sex, in a situation that's known as the Oedipus complex, which refers to, of course, the old story about Oedipus and how he unknowingly killed his father and married his mother. So Freud believed that boys and girls went through this stage differently. Boys are very prideful of their penises and horrified to find out that girls don't have them. So they realize that their fathers must be powerful, and so they repress their desires for their mothers and identify with their fathers. And so this would indicate the emergence of the superego. So basically, he would say that the Oedipal complex is resolved when the child was, you know, obsessed with his mother and wanting to get rid of his father, but then when he realized that his father must be powerful, he decided to repress his desires and identify with the father. So you can see why this stage is a little bit more controversial than the others. And girls, of course, they don't have penises to begin with, must conclude that they have already lost their penises and have only a lingering penis envy, which means that they are going to not develop as strong of a superego. So he didn't really know how to explain the development in girls as much as he could in males, because they didn't have the penis. So they were just left with penis envy. And so he would say then that once this Oedipus complex is resolved, at about ages 5 or 6, the child's personality is fundamentally formed. So basically then they would enter a latency stage, which is not really anything happens. It's ages 5 to 6 to puberty, and it's non-sexual. It's basically just preparing them for the genital stage, which begins at puberty and leads to adult sexuality. So you should definitely know how to describe some of the hallmarks of Freud's psychosexual stages. despite the fact that they're kind of crazy. So, in summary, for psychoanalysis, Freud believed that your adult personality is shaped by how you move through the psychosexual stages, which defense mechanism you used, and whether your ego is strong enough to balance the id and the superego. Psychoanalysis captured the public imagination in Europe and North America due to its explicit content, but it also produced a sharp rift with the emerging schools of empirical psychology. So even today, some believe Freud's framework to be timeless and brilliant, while others think psychoanalytical theory is nonsense. However, whatever side you're on, it is important to note that Freud's work did have some positive aspects. It welcomed women into psychoanalysis, wrote about the negative impacts of suppressing a woman's sexuality, and he was one of the first to argue that homosexuality was neither a sin nor a perversion. So overall, he was a mixture of intellectual vision and blindness, sensitivity and arrogance. So a little bit of both. He did have some really great ideas, but he also had some really terrible ones. But overall, for a lot of his ideas, there was little empirical support. A lot of people said that Freud was not a competent scientist or even a successful clinician, so he was known to have bullied his patients and ignored contrary evidence. So definitely take any of his conclusions and his theories with a grain of salt, for sure, because much of what he was doing wasn't exactly empirically backed. So we'll talk very briefly about some of the other psychodynamic approaches to personality. So some of Freud's followers modified his theories from within, while others broke away from him, or were rejected by him, and went on to start their own schools. Women in particular were obviously not overly pleased about his theories on penis envy. They considered them insulting and unscientific, which they were. And they basically stated that when women feel inferior to men, we should look to the disadvantages women live with and their second-class status, rather than their sense of penis envy. So there were two other major psychodynamic approaches to personality that we're going to discuss in the following slides, and they are Jungian theory and the object relation school. So we'll just take a minute to talk briefly about each of those. Jungian theory, so Carl Jung was once a close friend of Freud's, until they quarreled viciously about the nature of the unconscious. Jung stated that in addition to an individual's own unconscious, we all share a vast collective unconscious, which contains universal memories, symbols, images, and themes. So he labeled these archetypes, so kind of the things that were involved in everyone's unconscious, that everyone had some kind of experience of in their unconscious. So archetypes can be images, for example, the mandala, which is a magic circle thought to symbolize unity of life and totality of self, or figures found in fairy tales and legends, such as the hero, Earth Mother, or Wicked Witch. So, for example, he had a shadow archetype, which would represent the bestial evil side of human nature. So that archetype would contain such characters as Dracula, Darth Vader, etc. So he did kind of think that regardless of where you were from and how you were raised, everyone kind of had these archetypes in the back of their mind, in their collective unconsciousness. So although Jung shared with Freud a fascination with the darker aspects of personality, he had more confidence in the positive, forward-moving strength of the ego. And in fact, if we look at what research has found, scholars have found that some archetypes do appear in stories and images of virtually every society. People tend to be motivated not only by past conflicts, but also by their desires to fulfill themselves. And so he was among the first to identify extroversion and introversion as a basic dimension of personality. But he was still not overly empirical in his methods. Obviously, this is stuff that can't really be backed up so much by empirical evidence. And he did have some followers, left behind a legacy, but overall, kind of not something that we really take as scientific fact, for sure. So next we have the object relation school, which was basically developed in Great Britain by Melanie Klein and D.W. Winnicott and others. So these theorists believed basically that the central problem in life is to find a balance between the need for independence and the need for others. And so this requires constant adjustment to separations and losses. So the way we react to these losses is largely determined by our experience in the first year or two of life. If a baby's need for recognition is not heeded, the baby's personality will be warped. So this theory placed a lot of blame on the mother and other important adults in the child's life, in that they were the ones who were determining whether or not the personality was going to develop properly. So We use the word object because the attachment is not just to the mother when we talk about these relations, but to the infant's evolving perception of her. The child creates a mental representation of the mother, and mental representations of important adults affect personality throughout life. So it differs from Freud's theory in that both sexes identify first with the mother. So whereas in Freud's theory we had the little girls were wanting to kind of be with the father and the little boys were wanting to be with the mother, in this theory both of them first identify with the mother. And so it's basically involving the attachment to the mother and other important adults in their life. This approach can be applied to predict if a client will benefit from psychotherapy, deal with disability and loss, and to try and explain why some people harass others online. So what we see is that both sexes are identifying first with the mother, but then boys must break away from mothers to develop their masculine identity. And so therefore men develop more rigid boundaries between themselves and others than women do, which is something that we kind of do see. So some very interesting concepts. Again, probably not something that's super backed up in terms of empirical evidence, but nonetheless it is one of those other influential theories in terms of personality development. So now we're going to talk about, in general, some of the issues that we see with these psychodynamic theories. Because, of course, as I've mentioned several times in class before, anytime when we're talking about the unconscious motives and desires, it's very hard to quantify those things. We don't have a lot of implicit testing that is backed up with a lot of empirical evidence. So modern psychodynamic theories, despite the fact that they differ in many ways, they do share a general belief that to understand personality, we must look at those unconscious dynamics and origins. However, many psychologists in other fields regard most psychodynamic ideas as unscientific. Most of the major assumptions have not been supported scientifically, so there's no scientific evidence for repression of traumatic experiences, and we have questions like, how do object relations theorists know that a true self is being suppressed? So, in general, psychodynamic theories have been shown to be guilty of 3 scientific failings. The first is violating the principle of falsifiability. So a theory that's impossible to disconfirm is not scientific. Followers often accept ideas because they seem intuitively right and their experience supports it. And basically they then call anyone who goes against them defensive or in denial. So if you're unable to basically prove these people wrong because whenever you try to, they just tell you that you're in denial, then that's not a very good theory if it can't actually be falsified, as we talked about with falsifiable hypothesis in chapter 2 way back when. The second scientific failing is that they draw universal principles from the experiences of a few atypical patients. So Freud and others generalized from a few individuals, but they failed to confirm observations by studying larger representative samples. So it was more so arguing by anecdote than actually basing it on large samples of individuals. And Freud, for example, he even, when he was studying people, he wouldn't even sometimes observe them systematically. He would just basically talk to them and go home and write things down afterwards. So there was a lot of flawed methodology in terms of his research evidence, for sure. And the third scientific failing is basing theories of personality development on the retrospective accounts of adults. So theories that are based on themes and adult recollections of childhood, such as most of these psychodynamic theories are. We know that memory is often inaccurate and may create illusions of causality, whereas if we look longitudinally at some of these issues, the longitudinal studies often show very different results. So despite serious problems, some psychodynamic concepts have been empirically validated. We're not saying everything to come out of psychodynamic theories are invalid. There is evidence for some of the major defense mechanisms. The interaction of the mind and body have been demonstrated in the generation of stress-related physical problems, and we are often unaware of the motives behind our own actions. So despite the fact that, we do have a lot of scientific issues with these theories, there are some good things that come out of them, and they did kind of pave the way for further research, so we still talk about them today in terms of our theories of personality development. So that's it for psychodynamic theories. I'm going to very quickly just start a little bit about the modern study of personality, and I might go to maybe like slide 20 and then we'll quit, because there's only 42 slides in this chapter and we'll have plenty of time to finish that stuff up next week. So we'll just do a little bit more. So for years, people have been trying to fit themselves into personality types. So we see early Greek philosophers, they basically had 4 fundamental categories based on mixtures of bodily fluids. So for example, having an excess of choler, you'd be considered choleric. An excess of phlegm, you'd be considered phlegmatic. So these were basically their kind of personality types way back in early Greek times. Obviously super unscientific. And then another one that we talk about, and is a very popular test actually, is the Myers-Briggs type indicator. So it has 16 types, which are dependent on extroverted, introverted, and logical intuitive. However, this type of test has been shown to be not much more accurate than the body fluids. Less than half of people score the same test type 5 weeks later. And of course, as we talked about in the definition of personality, it's supposed to be stable, enduring traits over time. So obviously, if something's changing every 5 weeks, not a very good indication of your personality type. And then finally, we have objective tests or inventories. These are standardized questionnaires involving written responses, which are typically multiple choice or true or false, and they are much more scientifically valid and useful. So the only types out of these 3 that have been proven to have some scientific backing would be those objective tests and inventory. So using well-constructed inventories, psychologists have identified hundreds of different personality traits. So in terms of our core personality traits, we have Gordon Allport, who is one of the most influential psychologists to empirically study personality. He recognized that not all traits have equal weight or significance. So he basically said that most of us have 5 to 10 central traits, which reflect a characteristic way of behaving, dealing with others, and reacting to new scenarios, as well as some secondary characteristics, which are more changeable aspects of our personality. So for example, our music preferences, casual opinions, and habits. So the central traits would be the ones that are kind of more stable and unchanging over time, whereas we do have some of those secondary traits which are a bit more flexible. Then we have Raymond Cattell, who advanced Allport's theories by applying factor analysis, which we've talked about before. It's a statistical method that identifies clusters of correlated items that appear to be measuring some underlying factor. So hundreds of factor analytic studies looking at all of these factors and how they're related to each other, how they might be correlated, support the existence of the Big 5. So now we're going to talk about the Big 5 traits in terms of personality, and these are very important to know. I'll show you a nice little acronym to help you remember them, but you should definitely know what they are and kind of know how to give some examples. So, the first is openness to experience versus resistance to new experience. The second is conscientiousness versus impulsiveness. The third is extroversion versus introversion. The fourth is agreeableness versus antagonism. And the fifth is neuroticism, or negative emotionality, versus emotional stability. And you'll see if you've been following on the textbook, you might notice that mine are written in a little bit of a different order. That's because I've arranged them so that the first letters of each spell ocean, which is how I was taught to remember them when I was in psychology. It's not in your textbook that way, but I thought that's a really good acronym to help you remember them. So if you remember the word ocean, you can remember openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism, and then of course the other part is just kind of the opposite. So we'll talk a little bit more in detail about each of those. So in terms of openness to experience versus resistance to new experience, it's the extent to which people are curious, imaginative, and questioning, which would be more openness, versus predictable and conforming, which would be more resistant to new experience. We have conscientiousness versus impulsiveness, so the degree to which people are responsible or undependable, persevering or quick to give up, tidy or careless. So conscientious people tend to be more responsible, persevering, and tidy, whereas the impulsive people tend to be more undependable, quick to give up, and careless. Next, we have extroversion versus introversion. So that basically defines the extent to which people are outgoing or shy. So whether they're sociable or reclusive, whether they're adventurous or cautious, would be depending on their level of extroversion versus introversion. So each of these are kind of spectrums that you can kind of fall somewhere in between the two. Then you have agreeableness versus antagonism. So this is the extent to which people are good-natured or irritable, cooperative or abrasive, and the tendency to have friendly versus hostile relationships. So basically someone who's more agreeable is going to be more good-natured, cooperative, and have more friendly relationships, whereas somebody who's antagonistic is going to be more irritable, abrasive, and have probably more hostile relationships. And the fifth and final personality dimension is going to be your neuroticism versus your emotional stability. So it's basically the extent to which a person suffers from traits such as anxiety, inability to control impulses, and tendency towards negative emotions such as anger, guilt, contempt, and resentment. So if you're scoring very high on you know, anxiety and inability to control impulses and some of those negative emotions, you're going to be considered more neurotic. If you're scoring lower on those measures, then you're going to be deemed more emotionally stable. Of course, culture can affect the prominence of these traits and how they are reflected in language, but in spite of variations, the Big Five have emerged as distinct, central personality dimensions worldwide. The Big Five are quite stable over a lifetime, with some exceptions. Later adulthood tends to show a decrease in extroversion and openness to new experiences, and as young people mature, they may eventually become more self-confident and emotionally stable. Also, young people aged 16 to 21 are the most neurotic and the least agreeable and conscientious, but these trends seem to diminish in the 30s and 40s. So overall, the Big Five do not provide a complete picture of personality. We don't see anything that measures psychopathy, self-absorption, obsessionality, but they do lie at the core of key personality variations. And they've actually been observed not only in humans, but in other non-human species as well, which we'll talk about a little later. But that's kind of where I want to end off today. So next week, we'll pick it up here in the genetic influences of personality, and then, of course, I wanted to get through this much of it because then we'll have time to go back and review if we need to before the test the week after. So I hope this made sense to all of you. You can feel free to email me at any point during the week to ask questions, and I'll probably pop on Moodle chat maybe a little later in the week just in case anyone wants to chat through some of this stuff. So I hope you all have a great week, and I will see you next Monday.